Imagine standing in a desert. Not the kind of desert you picture when someone says that word, not a postcard with rolling golden dunes. This is something older, flatter, quieter. The air carries a fine white dust that settles on your lips and tastes faintly of salt and limestone. The sky above you is enormous, the kind of sky that makes you feel very small and very still. There are no sounds except the low, steady breath of wind moving across open ground. You are somewhere in what we now call southern Iraq, but that name Iraq would mean nothing here. Here, in this place, in this time, the land has a different name. It is called the land between two rivers, Mesopotamia and beneath your feet. Buried under centuries of collapsed mud brick and wind-blown sediment, there is something waiting. There are thousands of them, pressed into clay, baked hard by sun and fire, stacked inside rooms that no longer have ceilings. Tiny marks made by human hands, recorded in a substance that was never meant to last forever, and yet somehow did. These are the tablets, and what is written on them is only beginning to be understood. Most of us, when we think about ancient writing, think about mystery. We imagine hieroglyphs on pyramid walls, or Latin phrases carved into stone columns or scrolls in desert caves. We carry a quiet assumption that ancient knowledge was mostly symbolic, mostly spiritual. Prayers to gods, records of kings, stories of floods and heroes. And that assumption is not wrong, it just isn't complete. Because when researchers began feeding the contents of these ancient clay tablets into machine learning systems, what they found wasn't only myth. It was something far more structured, far more precise, something that looked in ways that are difficult to fully explain, like the early architecture of a thinking system. If you are listening to this late at night, maybe in bed with the lights off, or driving somewhere quiet with the windows down, welcome. This is Hidden Pages of History. And if you are new here, the kind of content we make is exactly this: slow, careful, honest storytelling about the parts of history that most people never get to hear. If that sounds like something you want more of, consider subscribing now before the next part of this story pulls you too deep to remember, because this one goes somewhere unexpected. To understand what we are talking about, we need to go back. Not just to ancient Mesopotamia, though that is where the physical story begins. We need to go back to the idea of information itself. What is it? How old is it? And why does it seem like humanity has always been, in some fundamental way, trying to build systems to organize it? These are not new questions, but they are questions that are being asked right now with a new kind of urgency, because the tools we are using to revisit history have changed. The clay tablets of ancient Mesopotamia, the ones discovered across modern-day Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Turkey number in the hundreds of thousands. Some estimates put the total count of surviving tablets across all known collections at close to 500,000. The majority of them have never been fully translated. Many have never been read at all. They sit in museum storage rooms, in university archives, in unmarked crates waiting. They were written in a script called cuneiform, which is one of the earliest known writing systems on Earth, and they date back as far as roughly 3003, 100 years before the Common Era. That is more than 5,000 years ago. For perspective, the Roman Empire, which feels ancient to most of us, wouldn't exist for another 2,000 years after some of these tablets were made. The early translations, done by hand over the course of decades by scholars who devoted entire careers to single collections, told a consistent story. These tablets were primarily administrative documents, records of grain distributions, lists of workers and wages, accounts of sheep and cattle and barley, trade agreements between merchants. And this made sense. Writing, the conventional wisdom goes, was not invented for poetry or prayer. It was invented for accounting. When the first human civilizations grew complex, enough to require keeping track of resources across time and distance, they needed a way to store information outside the human brain. The clay tablet was that technology. It was the spreadsheet of the ancient world, practical, functional, useful, and for a long time, that was more or less the full picture. Ancient people invented writing to track their grain. Later, they used it to record their kings and gods. And gradually, over thousands of years, writing became literature, philosophy, law, and science. A clean, linear progression, rational, reassuring. But here is where things get interesting. Because when computational linguists and AI researchers began applying modern language processing tools to cuneiform databases, particularly the collections housed in institutions like the British Museum, the Oriental Institute in Chicago, and the Louvre, they started noticing patterns that didn't fit neatly inside that clean story. The administrative records were there, yes, but embedded within them, and sometimes hiding inside documents that had been loosely categorized as ritual. Texts or medical prescriptions were structures that looked less like records of things that happened and more like instructions for things to do. Systematic instructions, branching instructions. If this, then that. If the fever persists after 3 days, administer this plant. If the debtor does not pay by the next full moon, apply this penalty. If the star appears in this quadrant during this season, predict this outcome. Conditional logic, rule-based reasoning, the very same architecture that sits at the foundation of every algorithm running in every system we call artificial intelligence today. Now, to be very clear, this does not mean that ancient Mesopotamian scribes were building computers. They were not. And it does not mean they were in contact with some advanced lost civilization, or that there is a hidden code beneath the surface of their writing. The people who made these tablets were brilliant, pragmatic human beings, solving real problems with the materials and methods available to them. But what the AI-assisted analysis of these texts is beginning to reveal is that the cognitive architecture they were building, the way they organized cause and effect, the way they nested conditional rules inside decision trees, the way they thought about exceptions and edge cases was far more sophisticated than we have historically given them credit for. And that gap between what we assumed about them and what we are, learning raises a quiet, unsettling question. What else have we assumed? Consider the Diagnostic Handbook. It is one of the oldest known medical texts in human history, written in cuneiform across 40 clay tablets, and it dates to approximately 1067, years before the Common Era. For a long time, it was read primarily as a spiritual document, a list of omens and divine signs, the domain of ancient priests who believed that illness was sent by gods and demons. and there is certainly that language in it. But when researchers applied computational text analysis to its full structure, what emerged alongside the ritual language was something else entirely, a systematic diagnostic framework. The handbook organizes symptoms by body part, moving from head to feet. It records observable signs. It notes patterns across patients. It makes probabilistic predictions, not in the language of modern medicine, but in the logical form of it. If a patient shows these signs, the likely outcome is this. If these other signs appear together, the prognosis is different. This is not superstition. This is pattern recognition. This is the foundational logic of machine learning, applied by human minds to human bodies, 3,000 years before anyone thought to give it a name. And the diagnostic handbook is not alone. The astronomical texts of Babylon, the series known as Enuma Anu Enlil, which runs to over 70 tablets, contain something similar. These are conventionally described as astrological omens. Ancient priests watching the sky and predicting earthly events based on the positions of stars and planets. And again, that framing is not incorrect. But modern computational analysis of the mathematical content embedded in these texts shows that Babylonian astronomers were not simply watching and guessing. They were building predictive models. They were recording data sets across generations, tracking the movements of Venus, Jupiter, Saturn, the Moon, and they were developing arithmetic procedures to forecast those movements with accuracy. The math they were doing involved what we now recognize as early forms of function analysis, plotting how a value changes over time, calculating the area under a curve. These are not primitive guesses at the sky. These are the beginnings of mathematical modeling, and the AI tools being used to cross-reference these tablets across multiple collections are finding connections between texts that had been separated across different archives, different countries, different centuries of scholarship, connections that no single human researcher would have been likely to find manually in a lifetime of work. What does this mean? That is honestly the hardest part of this story to sit with. Because the temptation, once you start seeing these patterns, is to reach for a dramatic conclusion, to say that ancient people were more advanced than we think, or that there is some hidden thread connecting Babylonian astronomy to modern artificial intelligence. And while there is something true buried in that instinct, the reality is both more subtle and more interesting. What we are actually seeing when AI reads ancient tablets is a conversation happening across 5,000 years. A conversation about the same problem. How do you take the complexity of the world, the unpredictability of weather, the inconsistency of human bodies, the movements of stars, the behavior of markets, and build a system that learns from it? How do you encode observation into rules? How do you turn pattern into prediction? Ancient scribes were asking that question with clay and a reed stylus. We are asking it now with silicon and code. The tools are incomparably different, but the question at its root may be the same. There's something else worth pausing on, and it is a detail that tends to get lost in the bigger discussion. The tablets were not just records of knowledge. They were mechanisms of transmission. When a Babylonian astronomer carved a mathematical procedure into clay, they were not just solving a problem for themselves. They were building a tool that could be picked up by someone else, in another place, in another generation, and used without fully understanding how it was derived. The procedure worked whether or not you knew why. And this is precisely how modern machine learning models function. You do not need to understand the internal process of a neural network to use its output. The knowledge is encoded in the system. The system operates independently of its creator. We tend to think of this kind of abstracted, transferable, automated intelligence as something new. But the clay tablet suggests that the impulse, the desire to build systems that carry knowledge forward and operate on their own logic, is something much older than we usually imagine. There are researchers today who would push back on this framing, and their pushback is worth taking seriously. The patterns we find in ancient texts, they would argue, tell us more about ourselves than about the ancients. We are living in an age defined by algorithms and artificial intelligence, and so naturally we look at old documents and find algorithmic thinking. The human brain is extraordinarily good at finding the patterns it is looking for. This is not a conspiracy, it is just perception. And they are right that caution is important here. Not every if-then construction in a cuneiform tablet reflects the same cognitive architecture as a modern machine learning system. Not every list is a database. Not every prediction model is a neural network in ancient clothing. The scholars who have spent their careers on these texts are careful, precise people, and most of them are reluctant to make the kinds of sweeping claims that make for exciting content online. But even accounting for all of that caution, something genuinely interesting is happening in this space. The scale of what AI analysis is revealing is difficult to dismiss. Projects like the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative have digitized hundreds of thousands of tablets and made them available for computational study. Researchers at universities in Germany, the United Kingdom, Israel, and the United States are using machine translation, network analysis, and pattern recognition to read these texts in ways that were simply not possible before. And what they are finding with increasing consistency is that the administrative, scientific, medical, and astronomical texts of ancient Mesopotamia represent a body of systematic, structured, rule-based knowledge that is far larger and far more internally consistent than the historical record has acknowledged. We are not talking about isolated, clever ideas. We are talking about a civilization that spent thousands of years building, testing, refining, and transmitting structured knowledge systems. And the technology that is helping us see this most clearly is the same technology that those ancient systems, in some abstract and foundational way, helped give rise to. Because here is the thread that is easy to miss. Modern computing and artificial intelligence did not emerge from nowhere. They emerged from mathematics. And mathematics, as we trace it back through history, passes through the Islamic Golden Age scholars who preserved and extended Greek and Babylonian knowledge, through the Greeks who explicitly acknowledged their debt to Babylonian mathematics, all the way back to the clay tablets of Sumer and Akkad, where someone first decided that the world could be described in numbers, and that those numbers could be organized into systems, and that those systems could be written down and passed forward. The line is not straight, and it is not simple, and there are enormous gaps and transformations along the way. But the line is there, and AI, reading the tablets that started it, is beginning to close something. A circle that was opened in the dust of a desert more than 5,000 years ago. What does it mean that the technology of the future is helping us finally hear the voices of the most distant past? Perhaps it means that intelligence, in whatever form it takes, tends toward certain kinds of questions. The same desire to organize chaos, to predict the unpredictable, to encode knowledge so it can outlast any single mind. That desire seems to run through human history like a current. Perhaps the ancient scribes who pressed their reeds into soft clay were doing something not entirely different from what an engineer types into a terminal today. Not the same, not equivalent in power or scale or consequence, but shaped by the same underlying need. Maybe the real story of artificial intelligence does not begin in a California garage in the 1970s or in a British mathematician's wartime code-breaking papers, or even in the formal logic of ancient Greek philosophy. Maybe it begins much earlier, in a room with no ceiling, under a sky so large it made everything feel small, where someone picked up a reed and decided that the patterns of the world were worth keeping. We may never fully know what those ancient minds understood about the systems they were building. We may never recover all the tablets, or translate all the ones we have, or understand every layer of meaning compressed into marks that are 5,000 years old. But we are getting closer. Slowly, carefully, in the way that real discovery usually happens, not with a single dramatic revelation, but with accumulated understanding, question by question, tablet by tablet, algorithm by algorithm. If this story made you think, if it opened a door you didn't know was there, drop a comment below. We read every single one. And some of the best questions that come in from you end up shaping the next episode. If you know someone who would appreciate this kind of deep, slow storytelling, share this with them. Not because of the numbers, but because this kind of conversation is better when more people are in it. And if you are still here, still listening, all the way to this last quiet moment, thank you. The hidden pages of history are always worth finding. We will see you in the next one. Hidden pages of history.